Well, I want to welcome everyone this morning. I'm Brian Pupa, Executive Director with the Legacy Project, and we always start with a little perspective in time and place. Scientists tell us there are more stars in the universe than grains of sand on all the beaches and deserts in the world. Here we are in an immense universe that's 13.7 billion years old, surrounded by billions and billions of sparkling stars on this tiny blue dot we call Earth, in the intriguing vision of a country called Canada. And I'm coming to you today from the Greater Toronto area, specifically our site, the Cedars, which is at the headwaters of the Beaver River. And we're on the traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and Mississaugas of Scugog Island. We gather in the spirit of being in the right place at the right time with the right people doing the right thing. This session this morning is titled 7-Generation Healing, Lived Experience in Place. It won't be like some of the other sessions we've done with Joe Brewer this week. In the 7-Generation work, we talk about your story in the context of the stories of lives and life on this planet, in the even bigger context of the story of lifetimes across generations. This session is about all of those nested stories and how we weave and reweave them in uncertain and difficult times. The 7-Generation work in the Greater Tkaronto Bioregion, which we abbreviate GTB, is part of the first North American cohort of a global bioregional activators network. This is an opportunity for the GTB to both lead and learn from other bioregions around the world. 7-Generation GTB draws on the seminal 1992 report that David Crombie wrote called Regeneration. He's former Toronto mayor, former federal cabinet minister. In that report, he defined the GTB as bounded by the Niagara Escarpment on the west, the Oak Ridges Moraine and up to Lake Simcoe on the north, and the Oak Ridges Moraine, which wraps around to the east, and Lake Ontario to the south. In the report, he also said that, quote, "We view regeneration as a healing process that restores well-being." Both David Crombie and the Honorable Pauline Browse are serving as honorary ambassadors for 7-Generation GTB. At this point, I'll bring in researcher, educator, and the founder of the Legacy Project, Susan Bosak.
Good morning. So my job this morning is to give you a little bit of context, because context is everything. The Legacy Project is a research, education, and social innovation group. We've been at this for 20 years. We've done research and development on various aspects of the 7-Generation work. United Way funded the 7-Generation community pilot work. Trillium further supported building 7-Generation communities. And we have 2-year ESDC funding to establish the 7-Generation GTB work. So we find ourselves in a moment of both coherence and opportunity. The work we do is systems complexity work. You probably won't get all of it today. In fact, we're only doing like a piece of it throughout all the sessions that Joe's done this week. There have been different angles on the work. So people have said, the more sessions I come to, okay, now I'm starting to get it, because the pieces start to come together. You may wonder, well, is this really what I'm doing? Is it connected to what I'm about and the work that I'm doing? And I would say yes, otherwise we wouldn't have invited you. This is about your thing, but it's about your thing connected to everybody else's thing and all the relationships and dynamics between those areas. We're looking at everything from environment and climate to health to education, all the way up to Indigenous worldviews and knowledge. It's like a big game of connect the dots, a very complicated 3D game of connect the dots. In the systems work we do, we talk about systems dynamics, and we're using 2 systems dynamics. The first is an intergenerational dynamic. Anthropologist Margaret Mead said that the connections between generations, now listen to this, are essential for the mental health and stability of nations. It's that big. These connections are that fundamental. And Indigenous people say that if you want to get something done in a community, you bring together a fired up youth with a feisty granny. That intergenerational connection has real energy. So we can find comfort and well-being in those connections, which are really important in this time of uncertainty. We can find power and we can find insight. So we're tapping in to that dynamic, and it allows us to get into communities in a really deep and profound and meaningful way. The other dynamic we're using is place, and it's a very specific understanding of place. And that's why Joe Brewer is here too. I know he's going to be talking about a number of things, but he'll also introduce the idea of a bioregion and why that understanding of place is so important. So the intergenerational and place-based dynamics ground the work, it gives it energy, and it allows us to reach policy and leadership levels, so top down, but also most importantly, the grassroots community, so bottom up. We have both of those flows going in the work. We're doing a complex dance between mitigation, adaptation, seeds. Again, this is deep and broad systems work. And I think that this could fundamentally change the way we move forward in the GTA and making important connections from the GTB, the local bioregion, to the Great Lakes Basin, to the continent, to the planet. It is that big if we weave all these pieces together in the right way. Now, before we turn it over to Joe, I want to briefly introduce you to some of the ways we're bringing in the dimensions of lived experience in place in the 7th-generation GTB initiative. Indigenous perspectives are really important. Many Indigenous peoples have a holistic perspective around health. For example, the First Nations Health Authority in BC has created a multicolored depiction of health as a series of concentric circles. And the model goes from the center circle of the individual to a circle with the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical facets of health, to the biggest circle that depicts the people that surround us and the places from which we come, meaning nations, family, community, and land are all critical components of our healthy experience as human beings. Now that goes way beyond a blood pressure check. Wendell Berry was an environmental thinker, and he also echoes a bigger view of health. He said, quote, "I believe that the community, in the fullest sense, a place and all its living entities, is the smallest unit of health, and that to speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms." In the 7th generation work, we're weaving in social prescribing. And social prescribing is a community-based pathway that helps move us from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. And that's a really big shift. So a physician can give a patient a prescription into community, into even nature. So it's a very different understanding of what a health provider can provide. From the final social prescribing pilot report that was led by Dr. Kate Mulligan, who we're working with as part of 7th-generation GTB, she says, what does it take for the healthcare system to truly integrate clinical and social care and to fully support the physical, mental, and social health and well-being of each person? We know that as much as 80 to 90% of our health outcomes are driven by the social determinants of health. For a person to thrive in health and well-being, they must have access to not only appropriate clinical care and material supports, but also to meaningful social support and a community where they feel they belong. Going from seeing yourself as someone with an illness to seeing yourself as a gift with something to offer is really transformative. It gives you a feeling of more control of your health and well-being. So social prescribing is this really powerful front end. And through the 7-generation work, we're trying to provide a fuller back-end community experience that goes beyond traditional programs. It's about relationships to each other and to our place. And that puts empowering people and building community capacity ahead of imposed program design and delivery. So we'll also put a link in the chat to the social prescribing discussion paper that I did with Dr. Kate Mulligan. The intergenerational dynamic, I touched on that briefly. One of the questions I have is, why do we routinely address the problems of children and older adults separately, when often the two ends of the age spectrum have similar or complementary needs that can be more addressed through a single intervention that addresses multiple issues and can often be more cost effective? I don't know why we think that they're separate, because they're not. The 7-generation work takes a system approach. It explores what matters in the big picture context of lifetimes across generations. Young and old form relationships in community, learning from and with each other around what's important to them. By strategically connecting elders and youth, we can improve their well-being while sparking far-reaching community impact. Research shows that intergenerational relationships can bridge silos, issues. They can even help bridge gender, racial, socioeconomic, and ideological divides. And because youth and elders often are less entrenched in the status quo, they can speak truth. They can remind us what really matters. They can connect us to what is real. The other thing we talk about is #ChangeTheStory. A society is about the bigger story we all share over time, the meanings, the values, the structures that guide us collectively. And as our stories crumble, we crumble, individually and collectively. People are feeling fear and uncertainty about what the future holds for themselves and even our human civilization. I mean, it's that big. Deep narratives from our past are breaking down, and we're trying to recraft them. Story is the most effective way human beings have to navigate the world. They give us psychological cover. They nurture healing. They allow us to imagine possibilities. They pass values on to generations that follow us. Stories bring mental order to chaos and some meaning to the seemingly meaningless. So human beings, through our relationships with each other and our place, create stories of meaning. And there's a quote that I often use to anchor myself from professor and eco-philosopher Dr. Roy Scranton. And he says, the human ability to make meaning is so versatile, so powerful, that it can make almost any existence tolerable, so long as that life is woven into a bigger story that makes it meaningful. It's just at this moment of crisis that our human drive to make meaning reappears as our only salvation, if we're willing to reflect consciously on the ways we make life meaningful, on how we decide what's good, what our goals are, what's worth living or dying for, what we do every day, day to day, and how we do it. That's a lot. That's a lot. And that's what we're carrying, right? To help all ages, as well as various local groups, build relationships and develop their ability to think in complexity, one of the things we're using is warm data, developed by Nora Bateson at the International Bateson Institute in Sweden. Bateson says that thinking in complexity requires the ability to perceive across multiple perspectives and contexts. This is not a muscle that's been trained into us in school or in the world of work. So we use warm data labs as an approach that helps people make connections they might not have made before and think in complexity. We're also using the sense-making work of the Cynefin Centre in the UK. Community sense makers take stories from their own life and connect them into a bigger context of stories. The emphasis on story opens windows to perceive differently and imagine possibilities, to make new sense. So particularly in the GTB, we have a huge population, and we need to know what's going on the ground in various parts of the GTB at any given moment. So Cynefin SenseMaker software translates the stories that we collect in a community into visual sense-making patterns so that we can take a pulse of what's going on in the community through the stories people share. So we were using the SenseMaker software that's really effective in terms of allowing us to get an understanding of what's going on the ground over time. So that gives you a really quick sense of the ways we're bringing in the dimensions of lived experience in place to the 7th-generation GTB initiative in a meaningful and pragmatic way. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Joe. He's a transdisciplinary scholar with a background in both earth sciences and cognitive sciences. He's doing on-the-ground regeneration work in a 500,000 hectare bioregion around Barichara, Colombia, and helping to create a global bioregional network. He's the founder of the Design Institute for Regenerating Earth, author of the Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, and I think that he will tell you that his most important job is being a father to his 6-year-old daughter, because he cares very deeply about the world that she's growing up in. So I am very pleased to turn it over to Joe Brewer.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, can we do a little round of applause for what Susan just shared? I'm oh my God. These ideas, they're so powerful and so important for weaving together story, place, history, social connectivity, wisdom traditions, the best of Western science, putting it all together. It's just beautiful. I'd like to begin by introducing my partner, Penny, who's here. She's going to be sort of hanging out on the sides while I'm presenting, but she's actually very focused in biodynamic healing and intergenerational trauma healing work. So what we're going to talk about today connects so strongly with her work. And so Penny may chime in later in the discussion if she feels that it's appropriate to do so. But she's also here feeling into the space to sense what we can do in our collective well-being. So Penny will be here as my sidekick for the talk today, but she's doing a lot more than, as some of you know, holding the field is not often visible or appreciated, and Penny's always doing it. So I just wanted to name her as we start. I also wanted to name my daughter, Elise. There she is. That's Elise right there. She's 6 years old. She's going to be with us on our journey today. What I want to do is, Elise is so sweet. Oh my gosh, she's in Colombia and I miss her. So Penny and I live in Barichara, Colombia, and we're involved in work at a large scale, trying to regenerate 500,000 hectares of land for an entire regional climate system, which means we deal with a lot of interpersonal dynamics, emergent patterns of trauma, and it's like a wrecking ball. You have this beautiful process going, and then someone's trauma response comes in, and it just cascades and triggers everyone else's emotional triggers. And this is at the foundation of the work we're doing. So a lot of people see me doing things like planting a tree in the ground, and they say, wow, we should have one planting trees. It's not hard to plant a tree. It's not hard to dig a little hole and put a tree there. It's not hard to water the tree every day. So the question is, what are these psychological and emotional barriers? And what are the social norms and the constraints from our economic and political contexts that get in the way of us coming into a place where we would do something like plant and care for a tree? It turns out that the obstacle is not the tree, The obstacle is our own internal dynamics and our interpersonal relationships. And so what I want to do today is I want to give you a little bit of a shared language for how we're working to create the context for large-scale cooperation. And so what I want to share with you is a body of knowledge that goes by the name of prosocial. And I want to explore 3 foundational pillars of knowledge that are connected with creating effective groups so that we can start to see that there's a shared space for understanding. And all of you who work in mental health or in therapy or in organizational management or just health and well-being in general, or if you work in community engagement, you're going to recognize what I'm talking about as directly relevant to the success or failure of your efforts. And so, so I hope that this will create a shared container for us to have a little bit of conversation afterwards. So with that said, I'd love to share my screen and give a little presentation. So today we're going to talk about how to regenerate our capacities to cooperate in service to Earth regeneration. Those of you who attended sessions earlier this month, earlier this week, will know that we talked a lot about Earth regeneration and bioregionalism, and we're really not going to talk much about that today. We're going to talk more about how to cooperate effectively. But I do want to give just a little flavor of the Earth regeneration work. And so those of you who've seen me speaking all week will recognize this. This is a framework called planetary boundaries, which is the Earth system processes that if we cross them, if we cross even one of them, then our ability to have a global civilization is called into question. And so I just want to name them briefly, that we're in a context where we need to deal with not only climate change, but also biosphere integrity, which is the rate of loss of the extinction rate for non-human species. Land system change, which is the degradation and destruction of complex and healthy ecosystems. Fresh water use, biogeochemical flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading or air pollution, stratospheric ozone depletion, which is related to protecting us from ultraviolet radiation at the Earth's surface, and then any novel entities. And the thing I want to name here is that if we cross even one of these thresholds for the planet, then basically there's a systemic breakdown and cascading collapse that occurs. And what the research community has shown with research published in 2015 is that we've already crossed 4 of them: climate change, loss of species, land system change, and biogeochemical flows. And then as the research progressed in 2021, they added freshwater use and ocean acidification. And then in 2022, they added microplastics, which are ubiquitous in all of our water supplies. So you'll find microplastics in every glass of water and in the breast milk of every woman on Earth. I say this to let us know, to remind us that we are in a context of immense and overwhelming complexity with profound systemic risks. And in this context, we have to get really, really good at collaborating. And so I'll let it sit there for now because all of the other presentations went further into Earth system science, and that's not really our focus today. But I just want to say that we're in a very serious planetary predicament. And if we don't learn to cooperate, we're in very serious trouble. And so with that in mind, what we're trying to do is to create the conditions for living locally in different parts of the world in terms of material flows, integrated life systems, and the thriving of families, which means we have to dramatically change how our economic and political systems work. This is absolutely huge. In a sense, you could say it's overwhelming and daunting in its sheer complexity. And that's why we're working to create a network of regenerative bioregions. And I just want to briefly say this because it's really not the focus of the talk today. But if you look at this map, you'll see that different colors represent different land types, different types of ecosystems based on the type of soil, local climate, and ecology, which means we need to create local living economies where the human culture and the human economy are in harmony with these local landscapes. And a bioregional approach is to organize ourselves in terms of holistic landscapes in this way. And so I apologize for being brief about this because we could spend the entire conversation today just on this topic. But I really want to move into the observation that transforming our local economic and political systems in the midst of planetary disruption, breakdown, and collapse is going to require a lot of cooperation. And that's the point I want to focus on today. And so I want to begin by making an observation that comes initially from the work of William James in a very important essay he wrote in the year 1890. For those of you who don't know, William James is considered to be the founder and father of scientific psychology, the scientific approach to psychology. And he's also a founding thinker in the philosophical field known as phenomenology. And William James was one of the first people to clearly articulate that behavior of an organism, of any kind of organism, is a relationship between sense-making of the organism's environment, information processing, and having a repertoire of behavioral responses. And so he took this way of thinking and applied it to the human brain, which is why he created some of the first systematic thinking about human behavior that created the field of psychology as a scientific discipline. And one thing he noticed was that there's this concept that you can look at, this measure called behavioral flexibility. Behavioral flexibility is if you take an animal like a paramecium and say, well, the paramecium is following a chemical gradient with little cilia, with little flagella, with little flapping arms. And its behavioral flexibility is move toward nutrients, move away from toxins, move away from predators, move toward prey. Its behavioral flexibility is really small. Whereas if you look at human behavior, we are like incredibly agile, adaptive, and creative. There are people who have falsely said that human behavior is a blank slate. It turns out that's not true, but the reason people thought it was true was because of the incredible diversity of behavioral responses that we can learn in our lifetimes, because of the incredible social learning and the immense brain capacity that human beings have to learn different kinds of behaviors. But what's interesting to notice is that behavioral flexibility might be the root cause of the Earth's ecological crisis. This happens because as human beings enter into a new environment, we develop new social norms and behaviors, ways of governing ourselves, technologies and tools that enable us to extract and utilize different environmental resources, which means humans, in the terminology of ecology, would be called a K-strategist, which simply means that they can change their carrying capacity by adapting to different resources in their environment. Humans can deplete and degrade a resource, and then adaptively shift to another resource and deplete and degrade it, and then adaptively shift to another resource and do this moving across the globe, empowered by social institutions and technologies, which is how humans have spread to every imaginable habitat on Earth, and we have degraded almost every habitat on Earth, placing ourselves at risk of extinction as we have instigated the collapse pattern that we saw in the planetary boundaries framework. So this means this behavioral flexibility may be the root cause of the Earth's ecological crisis. But part of our behavioral flexibility is that we are capable of having fragmentation, polarization, and conflict, and we need to understand what causes it so that we can guide the intentional evolution of culture, selecting the behaviors that are helpful for ourselves so that we can create the conditions for a shared purpose and collaborative action in service to life. And it is this ability to shift our behavioral modes through shared intentionality and intentional guided action, individually and collectively, that is so powerful for human beings. And what I want to talk about today is how can we cultivate and direct and guide and support the intentional evolution of culture toward these pro-social behaviors. You see, if we look at the history of cooperation in all species, we can see that evolution, that living systems, have given rise to many kinds of social organization, all of which embody key aspects of cooperation. So if you look at the chemical gradients that ants follow and the way that their body types are expressed through different genes because they're actually genetically identical twins, all of the females of this leafcutter ant colony are all genetically identical sisters. It's the expression of different parts of their genes and expression of collective behaviors that give rise to cooperation. And if we ask what are the conditions for designing our way to higher levels of cooperation, we need look no further than the slime mold. Slime molds are absolutely incredible because they are unicellular organisms. They're individual cells. And what happens is in moments of threat or scarcity, they self-organize into these tree-like structures you can see in the lower right to achieve collective goals, including that 99% of the individual organisms might sacrifice themselves by forming a branch that never reaches food, so that only those at the edges reach food and can continue propagating themselves. They actually engage in profoundly altruistic cooperative behaviors by having a context for cooperation. And so what we can learn from this is that there are ways of socially organizing to create contexts for cooperation, and that we can learn a lot from the rest of the living world through biomimicry and just the inspiration of nature's inherent intelligence to learn how to do this. So the question becomes, how do the patterns of interaction give rise to collective intelligence? How do those individual slime spores and how do those individual ants give rise to collective intelligence? How does a school of fish engage in swarm behavior to give rise to collective intelligence? And how do humans do it? See, we need to know this in order to successfully regenerate the earth, because we can't haphazardly or accidentally stumble our way. We can't blindly walk in the darkness toward a regenerative future. We have to mindfully and consciously guide our actions toward collaboration, because everyone on this call has experience of bringing a group of like-minded people together and having abject failure to cooperate, of people being too traumatized, of not trusting, of judging each other, of feeling insecure, of their shame and humiliation causing them to withdraw, and so on and so forth, which means we can't haphazardly collaborate. We must mindfully and intentionally guide ourselves toward collaboration. And this is where we can look to a large body of research. There are literally thousands of books and research studies, at least hundreds of methods and frameworks that can help us to learn to do this. I've got a few books here that just hint at that larger body of knowledge. And I want to draw attention to two books in particular. Pro-Social, using evolutionary science to build productive, equitable, and collaborative groups, which we're going to talk about today. And The Nordic Secret, which is a book about how the Scandinavian countries successfully created social democracies through insights about human development and a model of education called folk high schools. And we'll talk about both of these in the rest of the presentation. And so I just want you to know that we're drawing from a massive, library of knowledge. And I just want to focus on a couple of key elements today to show you that there is very profound knowledge, very profound practical experience that we can draw from to create those conditions for cooperation. And right now I want to start by quoting from one of my favorite behavioral economists, a man named Herb Gentis, who sadly passed away earlier this month. Herb Gentis was a transdisciplinary thinker, a complexity scholar, an evolutionary scientist, and a behavioral economist. And he said this: for human beings, our fundamental adaptation is teamwork. If you look at all other animals out in the world, you'll see that there are different animals that engage in teamwork, like wolves that hunt together to take down a deer. You'll see teamwork in ants. You'll see teamwork in schools of fish. You'll see teamwork in the herding behavior of horses or cows. But what humans do with teamwork is a whole different level, because we have shared semantics, shared language, the ability to accumulate knowledge, to share our knowledge and improve our schools and our skills and our tools. Humans do teamwork like no other animal on Earth. And we want to use this, leverage this, profoundly activate, unleash this ability for teamwork in service to regenerating the Earth. And this is where we come to the framework known as prosocial. If you want to learn more about what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, go to Prosocial World or find the prosocial book that I talked about a moment ago. What I want to say initially is that prosocial is not a framework. It's not like prosocial is a framework and then nonviolent communication is a framework and then sociocracy is a framework, as if it's just, a tool or a framework you might use. Prosocial is actually the integration of deeply coherent research and practice across many related fields. And you're going to see that in the way that I'll present it in the next few minutes. The foundational pillars of knowledge come from the study of the core design principles for managing the commons, from the large integrated field of contextual behavioral science, and from the massive library of knowledge and research and the evolution of cooperation. And I'm just going to briefly just skim the surface of these bodies of knowledge to show you how all of this works. Let's start with the core design principles for managing the commons. There's an amazing woman named Elinor Ostrom who passed away in 2010. She won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, the first woman in history to do so, for the research that I'm about to share with you. Lynn Ostrom was a professor at Indiana University. She was a political scientist and an anthropologist, and she studied a very specific problem. She studied how different human groups manage common pooled assets. She solved the problem of the tragedy of the commons by showing that Garrett Hardin laid out the description of the context incorrectly and incompletely. And she showed that it's actually quite common for human beings to solve the tragedy of the commons, but it only works when 8 criteria are met. And these criteria are commonly called the core design principles for governing the commons. I like to call them systemic capacities for governing the commons, but today I'll stick with their language of core design principles. So let's just briefly walk through them. Core design principle number 1 says that an effective group that is managing a common pooled asset together needs to have a shared identity and purpose. So look at those ants. They have a shared identity. They're all leafcutter ants of the same colony. They have the same purpose, to reach and acquire food. Look at those rowboats, the rowboat with the 4 women in it. They have a very clear sense of shared identity because they're all in the same boat. They're all rowing in the same direction. They're all wearing the same uniforms. And their purpose is to move that boat as quickly as they can from one place to another to win the race. They have a very clear shared identity and purpose. Also, you can see in this large group in the bottom, in a ceremonial space, that a group of people can stand in a circle and create their intention and their purpose of collective belonging and human connection as the shared identity and purpose in human ritual activities. So this power for shared identity and purpose is fundamental. A group will not function and there will not be effective cooperation without shared identity and purpose. Core design principle number 2 says that there needs to be an equitable share of contributions and benefits. Notice the word here is equitable, not equal. What this means is members of a group feel and perceive that there is a fair distribution of benefits based on contribution. Those who do more work get more benefits, because this is felt as fair. Because if someone does more work and others feel like they should have as much as them, then those doing more work feel taken advantage of. And this undermines collective morale. It undermines the shared purpose. It undermines engagement. So this ability to have a perception of equitable share of contributions and benefits is a fundamental part of effective cooperation. Core design principle number 3 says that there needs to be fair and inclusive decision-making. This means that the group of people needs to have a way of saying, well, if we have a decision, even if I don't like the outcome of the decision, I feel the decision was fair, and I feel like I had the ability to participate in how the decision was made. And if I don't like how the decision was made, I can participate in changing the procedures and protocols for how decisions are made in the future. What I want you to notice right now is to imagine where have you been in groups, maybe in work settings or with your family or at school, where decisions were made in a way that you felt were neither fair nor inclusive, which causes you to disengage, become cynical and bitter, and drop out of the group. Cooperation requires that we feel and experience the empowerment of participation through fair and inclusive decision-making. What you might already be noticing, we've only gotten to number 3, and there are 8 of them, is that most human groups today do not meet these criteria, and most of them do not work very well. That's because people have not developed a practice and a shared understanding like what we're talking about right now. Core design principle number 4 says that you need to have monitoring of agreed behaviors. Now, my favorite example of this is a game called the Good Behavior Game that was developed for 2nd graders, and then they extended it all over the place. It's now being used in more than 20,000 schools around the world. And the Good Behavior Game has many, many parts to it. It's got more than 30 years of research support. It's done in multiple countries and multiple cultures for multiple ages, and it works incredibly well. But one of the things they do is they have an activity called see, hear, feel, and do. So imagine a group of 7-year-old kids in a 2nd grade classroom. And with these kids, you write down a list. What do we want to see more of? What do we want to hear more of? What do we want to feel more of? And what do we want to do more of? And then right beside it, what do we want to see less of? What do we want to hear less of? And so on. And what happens is that the group creates a visual and socially recognized and socially agreed map of agreed behaviors. And then they help each other to express more of the helpful behaviors and to express less of the unhelpful behaviors. And this is a key part of the effective functioning of human groups. The next core design principle is graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behaviors. So this means once there are agreements about which behaviors are desired by the group, that we need to have small consequences for small infractions and larger consequences for larger infractions. It turns out that this ability to have graduated responding is so fundamental to human well-being that Christopher Boehm, an anthropologist who worked with Jane Goodall, when he changed from studying non-human primates to human hunter-gatherer societies to ask where does egalitarianism come from, he discovered that this graduated responding was fundamental. And it works like this. If you look at a primate like a gorilla, gorilla's a great ape, gorillas have dominance hierarchies where the strongest and most aggressive members can beat up and bludgeon and dominate others to form harems of females that are basically their sex slaves, and they beat up and even kill other males. Humans have the ability to do this, and we occasionally see it happen. These dominant, violent members of the community. So to create egalitarianism, we have to create reverse dominance hierarchies, which means the group has to stop the bully from rising to power. And the way that we do this is like this. If you have someone who's trying to take more than their share, who's being selfish or narcissistic, who's doing something that's unfair to the rest of the group, the initial response is gossip through storytelling, through talking to each other, where we say, you know, that guy Bob, he speaks out of turn and doesn't list very well. And when we share dessert, he takes a bigger piece of the cake and he doesn't share it very well. And then using gossip, we try to manage the social behaviors to encourage more helpful behaviors and discourage less helpful behaviors. But if that doesn't work, if Bob doesn't respond very well to that, then we can raise the stakes through temporary or permanent banishment. And this is something that's observed in the ethnographic record for hunter-gatherer societies. And remember, in hunter-gatherer contexts, to be kicked out of the human group is life-threatening. Our survival depends on being together in the group. Imagine if you're on the savannah of the Serengeti, to be kicked out of the group means a lion might eat you. So this is a big deal to be kicked out of the group. And notice ostracism or solitary confinement in prisons is one of the worst forms of punishment that humans can experience because we're such profoundly social beings. So temporary or permanent banishment is a big deal. And if that doesn't work, in rare cases, if Bob happens to be a highly skilled hunter and a serial killer, which, as we know, is very statistically improbable, but it does exist, that in extreme cases in hunter-gatherer societies, there is evidence that leads to the group agreeing to capital punishment, which is that they execute Bob to protect the rest of the group. And there's an ethnographic record of this. And Christopher Boehm's book, Moral Origins, surveys all this research and explains all this in detail. The important thing to notice here, though, is that there are different levels of responding, from more gradual to more extreme, allowing people to moderate their behavior, giving them multiple chances to participate. And while this example is severe and about the fundamental capacity of humans to cooperate in hunter-gatherer societies, throughout the vast majority of human history, you can translate the insight of this to all other contexts. We also need fast and fair conflict resolution. Notice that fast and fair are dependent on context. Fast might be that we resolve the conflict in the moment in the matter of 10 seconds, or it might be that fast means we have a deliberative dialogue over the next 3 months. Fast and fair are context dependent. But I think we all know what happens when there's a conflict that is not resolved quickly enough or in a way that's fair and inclusive enough, that gradually undermines morale and engagement and breaks down the coherence of a group. But these core design principles also tell us something else, that if a group has a shared identity and purpose, they also need jurisdiction authority. What I mean is, if they cannot govern themselves in service to their purpose, they cannot achieve their purpose. The example I want to give here is if we look at this map on the left, where you can see the New York metropolitan region, the Philadelphia metropolitan region, the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. metropolitan region, that they actually overlap with each other in jurisdictions. They overlap in the sense that they have watersheds, coastal estuaries, and other larger patterns that cause them to need to cooperate, but their urban boundaries and their state boundaries do not correspond with those ecological realities, meaning they don't have the autonomy to govern in service to their own landscapes. Whereas if you contrast this with the territorial region of indigenous peoples, like the First Nations people of the Iroquois or the Algonquins of these same regions, you'll see that the zone of governance corresponds with their territorial boundary, which corresponds with the ecology of place, which means they actually have the authority to govern their own lands. This applies to purpose as well as to place. I think we've all experienced being in a group where my group needs to accomplish something, but there's some other group who has authority about money, there's some other group that has authority about specific decisions, and we cannot actually achieve our purpose because the structure of the geography of purpose and autonomy do not match. This means they cannot govern themselves as a commons. Similarly, if we're ever in a context where our group needs to work with other groups, the relational field between the groups is a common pooled asset, which means all of these core design principles must apply to the collaborative relations with other groups. Now, the 5 nations of the Iroquois, and this map was 1650, shows that there were different territorial boundaries of different members of the Iroquois nation, and they created a council so that they could have collaborative relations between those groups. And that was the Nation of the Iroquois. And this creates what Eleanor Ostrom called polycentric governance, which means that there are many centers of decision-making, and they all collaborate around shared purposes while protecting the autonomy of each circle's purpose. Notice how different this is from hierarchical mechanistic organizations, and how different this is from most business contexts or work contexts that almost all of us experience on a daily basis. So you can see that all of these are core design principles for governing a commons, and they become design elements. You can use them to diagnose when a group is functioning or when it's not, to isolate and clarify where it's not and where to focus attention. And so these core design principles are of fundamental importance for governing the commons. Now I want to move on to another area, which is if we need our groups to be effective. We also need our group members to be capable of participating. And because most of us have grown up in historical patterns of intergenerational trauma, born into places with broken families and communities, with inhuman and damaging institutional contexts, most of us are pretty bad at cooperating. And so we have to heal our own personal capacities to participate. And this is where contextual behavioral science comes in. I want to begin by observing something, which is that human behavior is an evolutionary process. Just like how Charles Darwin's work showing that natural selection gives preferential advantage to traits of organisms, where those traits that are better matched to the environment will tend to propagate, and those that are not well matched to the environment will tend to go away, that human behaviors do exactly, literally exactly the same thing. And the founder of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, had this to say back in the 1940s. He said, "We have seen that in certain respects, operant reinforcement resembles the natural selection of evolutionary theory. Just as genetic characteristics, which arise as mutations, are selected or discarded by their consequences. Genetic characteristics give rise to consequences in the environment. So too, novel forms of behavior are selected or discarded through reinforcement." It looks like this. If you look at this image on the right, a mutation creates variation. Unfavorable mutations don't tend to survive in their environment. And favorable mutations, which means those that work better in that environment, will tend to reproduce and the mutation spreads. And this is how evolution works. Now, I'm going to give you a really disturbing example, but it's an example that's real and it makes the point. Let's say that there is a behavioral context where there's a wealthy company that sells a dangerous product, such as Philip Morris, who's the owner of Camel cigarettes. And they realize that for them to sell their cigarettes, they need to create an environment that spreads the behavior of smoking. And they know, as Susan identified, that intergenerational power patterns are really powerful, that if they can get young people to smoke, those young people will become role models for other young people, and they'll get one more generation addicted to cigarettes. So they invented, through marketing, a cartoon character called Joe Camel. They invented this cartoon character to create a behavioral environment that made it cool and socially desirable for young people to smoke. This selected for, reproduced, and replicated the behavior of youth smoking. But of course, this meant that they made money off of selling cigarettes, which means that they had the benefit of raising enough money to pay for even more marketing and even more public relations to manipulate the behavioral environment again. And even though cigarettes became known to cause cancer, emphysema, and to cause death, it was delayed in time by older people, and the behavioral environment did not reveal this. And of course, when the research started to show it, they began to do the same thing to discredit and confuse people about the science of the health risks of smoking. By the way, the fossil fuel industry later came along and hired exactly the same public relations and marketing firms to try to confuse people about the science of global warming, because this approach to selecting the behaviors in an environment is really, really effective. So this is where you can see that human behavior spreads as an evolutionary process. So now I want to share with you something that comes out of contextual behavioral science. And this is a work of a man named Stephen Hayes, who's just a wonderful, wonderful person and is one of the founders of prosocial. What he found was that the most powerful psychological basis for a successful life is our relationship between our idea of our present self and our future self. And that this ability to relate present self to future self has two psychological capacities: the regulation of emotion and psychological flexibility. The example I like to give is if I'm a college student on Friday night and I have a big exam on Monday morning, I can imagine my future self on Monday morning and say, wow, I really want to do well in that exam. Maybe I should stay home and study. And my imagining of the future becomes a selection environment for my behaviors now. But maybe I have a group of friends that are going to go out and have beer and pizza, and I really want to hang out with them. And my impulse and my desire is to go with them. But then I don't study for my exam. My ability to imagine my future self, to moderate my present behavior, is one of the most powerful abilities to guide ourselves toward the behaviors we want in our lives, to achieve the behavioral changes in ourselves. And it is this ability that gives rise to something known as acceptance and commitment therapy. Sometimes it's called acceptance and commitment training. And for shorthand, it's called the ACT matrix. And the ACT matrix works like this. You can divide your ability to perceive your own behaviors into two levels. And so the horizontal line divides the world into the upper and the lower. The upper is behaviors you can observe, like laughing, crying, yelling, someone interrupting someone else. Below the line is subjective experience, feelings, values, perceptions, subjective experience. The horizontal line or the vertical line divides the world into things that we want less of and things that we want more of. When we have this four-part quadrant, we can start to ask ourselves, what are observable behaviors I see in the world that I want less of in my life? What are observable behaviors in the world that I want more of in my life? What are internal subjective experiences that I want less of in my life? And what are internal subjective experiences I want more of in my life? When we ask these questions, right at the core of it is every mindfulness practice. You know, it could be Buddhist meditation, it could be yoga, it could be martial arts, it could be any number of noticing activities where we notice our present relation to our future self as we relate to these four different things: observed behaviors we want more or less of, and subjective experiences we want more or less of. It works like this. If you imagine this four quadrant, and I was to ask you, who is someone that you really admire, someone you want to be more like? So you could go into quadrant 2 and write down a list. What do you see that person doing? What are observable behaviors? Maybe you see them being helpful. Maybe you see them being kind. Maybe you see them giving someone a hug who needs it. What are observable behaviors you see them doing? And then you could ask, well, which values and feelings are being expressed? These are the subjective experiences that you'd write down in quadrant 4. And now imagine someone you don't want to be like, someone you think is a role model of bad behavior. What do you see them doing? I see them being selfish. I see them interrupting other people. I see them taking more than their share. And you write those behaviors down in quadrant 1. Which values and feelings are expressed? Selfishness, impulsiveness. It might be anger or inability to control their feelings. And you can write those down in quadrant 3. And now when you write them down, you can meditate on how often do I see myself engaging in the observable behaviors that I want less of? How do I feel about that? How often do I engage in the kinds of behaviors I want to see more of? How do I feel about that? And as you do this, you start to create an internal navigation system in your own body to guide yourself toward the behaviors you want more of in your life. This is how the ACT matrix works. Now, what's amazing is you can do this for individuals, but you can also do it for groups. So let's say you're in a group, and in a group you say, well, what are some group experiences I've had in the past that I want less of? What are some behaviors I've seen in groups I want less of or more of? And you can write those down in the same way. Or as a group, you could say, as a group, what are behaviors we want to see more of? What are behaviors we want to see less of? And we can collectively create a group ACT matrix. By going through an activity like this, we create a collective understanding of individual purpose and individual human development, individual healing and self-improvement, as it aligns and resonates with shared purpose and identity of the group. What's amazing is you can use the same approach to address all of Eleanor Ostrom's core design principles. So you might say, okay, let's take core design principle number 1, shared identity and purpose. What is my personal identity and purpose as it relates to the group? And what kind of identity and purpose do we together as members of the group want for the group? Or let's take fast and fair decision making. What are some ways that I would like to participate in decision-making? What are ways I don't want to participate in decision-making? And then how does that relate to how all of us collectively want to engage in decision-making? And you can use this process to refine and improve, evaluate and monitor how your group is doing for all 8 of Eleanor Ostrom's core design principles. So as you can already see, there's so much here. I'm just scratching the surface. I just want you to see that there are huge bodies of verified, scientifically supported knowledge and best practices. There's a huge amount of techniques and tools that are incredibly powerful to use to design our way to cooperation. But there's another piece of this, which is that when you're in a group, you'll notice that nothing is static. The members of the group are individually evolving their capacities, and the groups as a whole are evolving their capacities. So the question becomes, how do we cultivate and guide human development across our lifespans so that our groups become more powerful over time? And this is where we get to the story of the Nordic secret, which is a story of folk high schools that enabled people to move up the levels of psychological development. Specifically, they focused on how to move from the level that here in this graph is called third order, the socialized mind, to the fourth order, which is self-authoring mind. The difference here is that before the folk high schools in the Nordic countries, which began to be established in the 1870s and 1880s, beginning in Denmark, and then spreading to Norway, to Sweden, to Finland, to all of the Scandinavian countries, is that the socialized mind said, well, if I'm a farmer, I need to be a good farmer. I know what my culture tells me I should be. To move to the level of the self-authoring mind, which is I may have been born as a farmer, but I really want to become a teacher, and I'm going to author my own story, which is a deeper psychological capacity that involves more abilities, and the schools help develop that. But then you have this fifth order, the self-transforming mind, which is, you might say, well, not only do I want to be a teacher, but I want to be the first woman who's ever been a doctor. I want to transform the possibilities for the stories of people in my culture. This entrepreneurial spirit, this transformational change agent. And so this way of thinking about developing these capacities is the Nordic secret. There was a folk high school system that focused on developing human capacities to get as many people as possible to self-authoring and self-transforming levels, which is what you need for a functioning social democracy. So with that idea in mind, imagine this. Imagine that you somehow could measure all the members of your group, all the members of your society, where you say there are those who live out the stories of society, they just adopt and inherit it, those who are able to author their own story, and those with transformational capacity. And this is a completely imagined graphic, but imagine that at some earlier time, 50% of the people just live out the stories of their society. 30% can author their own story, and 20% have gotten a transformational capacity. I suspect those are really high numbers, and that's not realistic. But let's say that we knew how to use these pro-social processes and groups to design for human development, so that at a later time, maybe only 25% live out the stories of society, 50% author their own stories, and 25% have transformational capacity. What I'm showing you here is that you can form cooperative groups, and then those cooperative groups can learn how to support human development. And as they collectively support human development, we change the population statistics so that there's a greater composition of activated change agents and effective collaborators who can cooperate together and creatively solve problems and adapt to changing environments, which is exactly what we need in our current planetary context. And so this leads to the evolution of cooperation. I'm going to go through this part more quickly because I want to get to discussion. So I apologize to rush, but you can see that I'm hungry to share this with you, and there's so much here, but I'm really just wanting to paint the big picture. And I want to paint it well enough that our conversation is really rich, and so that we can identify actions to move forward to cultivate exactly these kinds of capacities for the Greater Toronto area. So with that said, the third pillar of pro-social processes is the evolution of cooperation. We've already touched on this with ants and slime molds and fish and birds, but I want to just touch on it a little more. You see, if we know that human behavior is guided by consequences, the way that B.F. Skinner said, if we know that we can change the selection environment for our behaviors, that means we can guide evolution. We can take what is known about evolutionary studies. And one of the founders of pro-social is an evolutionary biologist named David Sloan Wilson, who's a dear friend of mine and a collaborator. And Penny and I are going to go stay with him in his home next week to explore deeper collaboration. So we can bring all of the knowledge about the evolution of cooperation. So imagine that if we know how to form teams that actually work, those teams are themselves, they are selection environments. You have a team, that team has a set of social norms. Those social norms reinforce some pro-social behaviors and they discourage some anti-social behaviors. The group itself is the selection environment, which means we can design selection environments for nature connection. We can design selective environments for gender inclusion. We can design selective environments for empowered participation. We can guide normative outcomes by the kinds of social norms in our groups. We become, as David Sloan Wilson says, wise managers of our own evolutionary process. And we do this by selecting for the values and behaviors we want, the way that you saw in the ACT matrix. And then we form teams that actually work, that are guided toward the outcomes we want, which means we can coordinate actions around bioregional regeneration, which is we can work to the scale of landscapes and regions, and then they can collaborate toward planetary goals. Those of you who saw my other talks this week, that was what we talked about. We talked about bioregional regeneration. We talked about moving up and down watersheds for entire continents. And we talked about interdependencies of the Earth system. All of those, when you say, well, how do we do it? We do it by what I just said. We do it by understanding how to govern the commons. We do it by mapping and guiding individual and group behaviors. And by doing that, the groups become selection environments for better cooperation. And those enable groups to collaborate as multi-group complexes or collaborative alliances. And this is the only way that we can guide ourselves toward planetary regeneration. The key to all of this, as Herb Gintis said, is teamwork and knowing how to cultivate healthy human development within the groups that we create. So if we want to restore planetary health and safeguard humanity's future, this requires us to cooperate well across many scales of complexity. And as you can see in what I just shared, there are very powerful tools to help us create functional groups while growing the capacities of their members. And so this is what we're doing with what Penny and I are involved with, and our friend Benji Ross, who's here on the call with us, creating a design school for regenerating Earth. We have work in Barichara, Columbia that I didn't talk about today. We're actually here in Toronto helping build a planetary network of bioregions. So I just wanted you to know that this talk, right now, you are part of this process and you can step up to higher levels of engagement in any ways that make sense to you. And so the question becomes, are you ready to help regenerate the entire Earth, to become a regenerator of the Earth through local groups and this healing process that those local groups enable? We didn't really talk about how to organize ourselves into a bioregion, but many of you on this call were in other sessions this week. But really, are you ready to collaborate at the scale of your entire landscape or your entire region to do this? And then that's what I want to talk about. And so I'd love to open it up for discussion now. And as you can see, the important thing here is that there is a massive, massive body of knowledge and tools to help us do this. And what we need is shared understanding of it. We need to know how to do it together. And so maybe before opening up for questions and discussion, I'd love to just pass it back to Brian to help us continue weaving the context of what Legacy Project is doing here in the Greater Toronto area and how this work relates to that larger vision.
Thanks very much, Joe. That gives you a wonderful introduction to pro-social and cooperation. That's one element of social regeneration. Susan talked about earlier about social prescribing, which is another element of it. And Joe and Penny have been doing a lot of work also on trauma healing. So if you'd like to talk about that, we can open up a discussion about that as well. I know Chantel has a question.
I'm curious about trauma. So Brian mentioned trauma healing, and to me, this entire process sounds like trauma healing, right? It's getting back to what we've been deeply missing inside. And I'm wondering, in my experience with healing trauma, often as we get closer to some of those hurt points, pain points, things start to come forward. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that and how to navigate traumas that might be coming up and how to best hold that in community and to recognize what it is coming forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually think I'll invite Penny to share on this first, because this is a lot of the work that she does.
Yeah, so there's so many ways we could go with that. Such a good question. But I think I might just start with one of the things that Joe was showing was the ACT matrix. And when we start to think about what really matters to us, what's really important to us, who do we want to be in the world, how do we want to be of service to life, then as we start to move towards that, this is when all of our traumas start to arise. It's all the parts of us that are stopping us from actually living into that purpose and staying on purpose. And so that's what, the other side of the matrix, when we start to feel these fears or the behaviors that move us away from our purpose. So underneath that ACT matrix is the trauma healing work. It's how do you actually be with those fears in a way that transforms them? And how do you do that in a group? So how do you start to do that collectively? Because actually we can't do it alone. The traumas are relational in nature. So we have to do it in groups, and we have to, we have to do it together. So that's just a beginning, but it's, there's ways to do that. There's ways to learn to be with those kinds of pains and transform it through the body and do it together. Yeah, so that's how I'll start. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add a comment because I suspect Hillary has something to add on this from her experience and knowledge. Before though, just as almost like a transition step, what I found is that some of the most powerful traumas are completely invisible to us, meaning there's this very profound process of decolonization and unlearning, where it's not that we know something that's wrong, it's that we know something that place of knowing blocks us from seeing something else that we need to know. And we actually have to remove it to see the other thing. And so there's this way in which I've seen many examples of people sort of trying to fill their needs with some kind of coping mechanism. And that coping mechanism causes them to fill up their awareness with something, but that doesn't actually address what they need. This is what cognitive behavioral therapy was about back when that was a really popular way of thinking, was you have a story about how things work and your story is actually not true, but it's a coping mechanism. It's like, oh, well, people just aren't trustworthy, which isn't true. But, you use that as an excuse to not engage. And then what happens is we live out a story that undermines our ability to have our real needs met. And we have to see that story and then let it go to open up the space where we see what's really going on. And so in that sense, part of this trauma healing work is about therapy for our narratives. We're basically becoming aware of the stories we live. And this is very personal, by the way. This is like, what kind of a wife am I? What kind of a father am I? What kind of a person am I? It's like these personal stories that are where all this plays out. And so this gets at a thing that I think is really important. And then I'll pass it to Hillary. to continue the conversation, which is that there's all this focus because of Cartesian dualism, this idea the mind and the body are separate, and humans are separate from nature, and men are separate from women, and all these different things, that there's a sense that the world is broken and we have to fix it, which is based on that illusion that things are separate. And it turns out we can't really fix anything in the world unless we're doing this inner work on ourselves. But this inner work, because that separation isn't real, the inner work connects to the outer work. It's like, oh, I find that I help my friends, or I do better gardening, or, whatever, like I plant trees, or whatever it is. My engagement into the world is part of my own healing process. That's internal work, and they're just not separate. And so I'll stop there and pass it forward, because I think that will create a tantalizing flow, and I'll pass it on to Hillary.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to add to that, Joe, because I think one of the opportunities we have in this work is to leapfrog. And I think we can, and behavioral sciences have locked us in some ways to a certain construct and certain ways of seeing things, and sitting underneath under behaviors or beliefs. And sitting in those beliefs are a lot of the trauma stuff that Chantel was talking about. And I love the idea of how do we go about doing this work together in fundamentally different ways. So a lot of this is about play, and allowing us to come back into play, because it's through play that we can explore, right? And see things in very, very different ways. When we get out of these friggin' heads of ours, and we allow ourselves to get back into that childlike innocence that is the doorway to, because what trauma does when it happens to us is we freeze the most beautiful parts of us. And I see Chantel nodding, and that's why I think the Arctic Circle wants to help us in dealing with trauma healing, but that's a whole other story. But what I think here, it's like, for an example, you can do strategic planning with equine therapy, where you go to with an equine therapist, and you identify the team goals, and then you identify the obstacles that are getting in the way of those team goals, and the horses help you figure out how to unblock those obstacles, which is in fact buried trauma. And you still come up with a strategic plan, but the horses have helped you do it. And there's another way in which in stormwater management, what I've done is I've asked people, what's the stormwater in your life? And starting to look at how do we integrate these parts of ourselves with major planning, that we can do it together, but we do it in a very different humanistic, it's also very spiritual way. And we have to bring more concept of ceremony back into and sacredness back into these conversations as we play with sacred play. So I guess what I'm saying is we're on the tip right now of a massive regeneration of how we go about having these conversations, how we go about having these co-creations, how we go about doing all the things that you beautifully described. It's the how we do it now, which will, I think, bring the breakthroughs. So thank you for you and Penny for all your work.
Can I get an amen? And then pass it on to Brenda. Brenda, on to you.
Thank you very much. This has been an amazing presentation. A couple of things I want to speak about. First of all, the idea of trauma. When there is a trauma happening, and if it's not us who are going through the trauma, human behavior naturally divorces ourselves from feeling what those who are going through that trauma. The Holocaust is one very, very good example. Other world traumas that have happened in the past. If you're not in it, you can't feel what those who are feeling. You can't feel like them. Sometimes there's even disbelief that this is actually happening until you hear about it later, or until someone you know personally has gone through that particular trauma. The same, I do grief and bereavement facilitation. The same happens when a loved one dies. You don't know how that person feels unless you personally have gone through the similar experience that person has. You you can't walk in somebody else's shoes until you've been through that experience. I think that's very important, that human nature would be able to be more adaptable when it comes to understanding that, particularly when someone dies, a loved one dies, and the things that people say, you have to wonder, where are they thinking, and are they living in the same world I'm living in? It's they're all well-intentioned, but they're really dumb. A lot of the thing I had that happen to me when my husband Norm died. That's the other thing interesting that I think Hillary mentioned, equine therapy. It's a very interesting concept. Years and years ago, my late husband and I were involved in the Jewish community in some charity work we were doing with an equine therapy farm in Israel. And if you want to go to the experts about anything in this world, trauma, equine therapy, all of the things that we were talking about, this whole presentation, you really need to look at the Israelis. They developed a system where they took physically handicapped kids and put them into a program involving equine therapy. And when those kids got on the horse, it was absolutely transformational what happened to those children. It was absolutely amazing. So it does work. Animal therapy of any type, even they bring dogs into seniors' homes for senior home therapy, which is amazing. So I'm all for that. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I just want to make a promotion for anyone who's on Netflix. There's a movie called Lighthouse of the Orcas that explores how autistic children have been healed through connecting with those amazing whales, which beautifully exemplifies what you're talking about with another human to more than human relationship. On to you, Ben, please, and welcome.
Hi, thank you. And this has been great. I really appreciate it. I'm calling in from Peterborough, or Nogojiwanong, which is Michisagi Anishinaabe territory. I have a question. So I really enjoyed and appreciated the discussion of healing from trauma and its relationship to collaboration. And my question is related to my experience doing health research in Ecuador and having some familiarity with Colombia. And so where I'm coming from is understanding that there are processes of trauma that are ongoing, and the causes of them in the form of things like agribusiness and mining industry, expropriation of land, and the violence that's been used to make that happen. And that includes, for example, Canadian mining companies in Colombia and the Canadian government working with the Colombian government to do that. So what I'm curious about, if the sources of trauma are ongoing, despite the peace process in Colombia, how does the work that you're doing in Barichara relate to those bigger economic questions that may undermine what you're trying to do? I'm really curious about how the very insightful work you're doing relates to some of the stuff that I see going on in the background.
Wow, that's such a great question. Let me just start by saying that for those who don't know the history of Colombia, because I'll give you a flavor of it, is that for 57 years, there was a period that's just called La Violencia, the violence. Some people call it a civil war, but that's not really accurate. And it was a multipolar situation where there were different groups, and often in the same place, there were three groups who were actively killing anyone, like basically street-based terrorism, actively killing anyone that might be on the side of either of the two other groups. And in every one of those situations, one of the groups was government-sponsored death squads, which means the government of Colombia was just indiscriminately killing its own population alongside narco-traffickers, alongside paramilitaries. And this situation happened over the span. 57 years means 3 generations of people were directly affected. And so to be in a context like that, where even to this day, Colombia is #1 per capita for assassination of environmental and indigenous leaders. Brazil has more overall, but Brazil's country is 5 times larger. But if you look at per capita, Colombia is #1 in the world. But it's specific regions where this occurs. It's not the whole country. It's specific places that are called red zones. But to be in a context like this, where the government itself gets away with murdering its own population. Last year, government police officers were murdering people in the streets in Medellin and Bogota. And so it's not like last century, it still happens. And so in a context like this, where basically assassins are hired by international mining companies to murder indigenous and environmental leaders to steal their resources, sometimes to create so-called green energy and clean tech solutions, like the mining of metals that are used as part of electric cars or solar panels. So it's like the world is very complex in all of this. Then when we're in a context like that, one thing that happens is that it's very difficult to sustain trust. It's like I've been very mindfully building trusting relationships with people in Barichara, and then every few months, someone just sort of spins out, meaning that they love me, they trust me, they love what we're doing, we're all collaborating in this really open community process, and then the whole thing just unravels and falls apart because one person had a trauma trigger that may not have anything to do with me. It just happens somewhere in the group, and it creates this cascade effect of everyone's everyone's trauma responses. And then like the trust and confidence goes haywire, and the discernment of the past goes out the window. So it doesn't matter that for the last 6 months, we've had weekly meetings where we're all getting along great, and it's going really well, and we're healing, and then it just spins out. And you're like, where did that even come from? Yesterday, we were all friends. We were like loving each other, and it's been consistent for months. And now everyone's got suspicions and confusion. And maybe I shouldn't be a part of this. And I feel like there are power dynamics around money. And what you can find is that there is neurophysiology involved. It's not simply, do I love you? It's not simply, do I feel good around you when I'm around you? It's, well, what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning when I've been arguing with my wife about something that's going on, and then someone triggers money as part of a dynamic that's in a really healthy pro-social process, but now I'm just going to be like a wrecking ball into my relationship to that process because my own physiology, my brain and my immune system are telling me you're threatened with death and you're terrified and you have to protect yourself. It's in those contexts, in those moments, that we have to get really good at being non-judgmental and accepting, that we have to practice compassionate listening. By the way, I'm still not that good at this. It's hard. What I mean to say is I'm practicing and I'm better than I've ever been, and it's hard. And so what I see is that what you're saying, Ben, about that these root causes are still happening. Like, as I said, in Colombia, number one per capita for assassination of environmental leaders, it's still happening. And it's happening to the friends of my friends. So while I don't directly see it, because Barichara is a little island of stability and peace in Colombia, but my friends have relationships all across Colombia. So it might be that one of their friends was just killed, over in the Cauca or over in these places that are like in the Amazon. And so they are immersed in those trauma-inducing environments. And so therefore, I am too. But as Brenda said, I don't know what it feels like because I don't experience it. So I'm blind to it. Just like out of nowhere, everyone starts sort of melting down in their trust. And I'm like, what's going on? Like, I thought we were good. We were good 10 minutes ago. And it's because these trauma-inducing environments are coming from many different directions. So this way of being pro-social, over time, it takes the volatility of that and it lowers it. Over time, it increases the stability, but it's over time. It's not instantaneous. So I just want to name that there's so much about this we could talk about with concrete examples and all of that. But I think you can feel the level of capacity for managing this complexity, how much capacity we have to build in ourselves to be able to do this work. And it's a lot. I'd love to invite Ryan onto the screen. I'd love to just invite you to bring us forward.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe, and thank you to everyone present. Wonderful questions and discussion. Just to sum up, bioregional work is whole systems work. And we've talked about today how everything is connected, and you have to look at the inner self, You have to look at the relationships in community. You have to look at social regeneration and ecological regeneration together. They go hand in hand. And we've been exploring that throughout this week-long series of events with Joe. The 7th-generation Greater Tkaronto Bioregional work is looking at all those levels. We have a broad collaboration. So we're weaving together local projects, on-the-ground projects across the bioregion, while at the same time working with organizations. We're working with the City of Markham, Markham Public Libraries, York University, Toronto Region Conservation Authority, City of Toronto, because we have to work at the grassroots and at the leadership level at the same time. So lots happening, so stay tuned. And again, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Penny. Thank you for everyone present.